Shadow Justice Secretary is joining us from Westminster. Conservatives, of course, have accused David Lammy of covering up that accidental release of another prisoner during PMQs. Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick has called on the Deputy Prime Minister to return to the Commons to clarify the record. I'm sure he called for that yesterday afternoon. He was probably going to call for that this morning. I mean, it was an unedifying sight, wasn't it, at Prime Minister's questions yesterday, Mr Jenrick, to see the Minister not answering the clear question from the Shadow Defence Secretary and then not returning to the Commons to explain what had happened.
Yeah, well, good morning. Look, I thought it was one of the most shambolic performances by a senior Cabinet Minister I've ever seen. And worse than that, you had David Lammy, the Justice Secretary, finding out the night before that a convicted sex offender, illegal migrant, had been accidentally released from a prison and was on the streets of London, that had happened 6 days earlier, and yet the Met Police hadn't been informed. And what did he do? We're told he went out to buy a suit the next morning instead of trying to lead the response, and then he came to Parliament and essentially tried to conceal this. He didn't answer 5 straight questions, even though he knew the answer, and tried to spare his own blushes rather than being straight with the public and starting to find this dangerous man. I thought it was a total and utter shambles of a kind I haven't seen in years, a dereliction of duty by David Lammy.
Why didn't James Cartledge just ask him direct? They said they knew someone was released. Why didn't they go in direct and say, we know people have been released, you're lying, and call him to account there and then?
Well, I think the story was about to break and hadn't yet been confirmed either by the Met Police or the Ministry of Justice. And so James Cartledge perfectly reasonably gave David Lammy the opportunity to set the facts out in the public domain, given he was the Justice Secretary and he knew the facts.
David Lammy's argument that he didn't want to release it before it was official. And so the argument you're giving for the Conservative could well have been in David Lammy's mind. Maybe I better not say.
The Met Police immediately debunked that and said that they had no objection whatsoever to David Lammy standing at the dispatch box and saying it like it was. And in fact, it would have been helpful because there's now a manhunt underway trying to find a dangerous man who endangers the public. And if David Lammy had helped to get that message out, it would have been helpful. Because look, this is serious. We can laugh about David Lammy and the clown show that he did in the House of Commons and the way he's conducting himself as the so-called Deputy Prime Minister of our country. But this is the second convicted sex offender, illegal migrant, who was due to be deported in 2 weeks, who has now been allowed to walk out of a prison without so much of anyone trying to stop them.
Okay.
And this man is out on the streets. And his victims, imagine how they feel this morning. We heard from the Epping victim earlier in the week, from her family and her, and she said she couldn't get to sleep. She was racked with worry and fear that that man might be on his way back to Epping and might cause her further distress in the future. And so there will be victims in London or elsewhere in the country today who are seriously worried because of this massive failure by the Ministry of Justice. And David Lammy needs to get a grip.
You made some very serious points, and I'm sure you're absolutely right that people are frankly terrified that there is a sex offender and another person wrongly released. 3 people in total have been, haven't they, that we know of. But there's also the point, and we're going to be speaking to the National Chairman of the Prison Officers Association, Mark Fairhurst, later in the programme, that the prisons are in a mess. They're in an absolute mess. They were in a mess and too few were built under your watch, many argue. So, you know, we all watch that spectacle. We know that David Lammy's under pressure, but the Conservatives aren't going to be able to wash their hands of this mess, are they?
Look, I'll be completely honest with you. The last Conservative government's record was poor and unacceptable. It should have built more prisons. I want to see more prisons built. I want to see them built faster and cheaper. I want to lock up more dangerous offenders for longer. Having said that, the ministers at the time did strain to keep prisoners inside. They didn't create an early release scheme like the one this government's done, where dangerous people are only going to be serving as little as a third of their sentence. And the numbers of people, criminals, being released accidentally from prisons has more than doubled in the last year under this Labour government. Now, I'm not excusing anyone being released accidentally. One is too many. That is completely unacceptable. But something has gone very badly wrong over the course of the last year. The 10-year average for the number of people being released accidentally was about 55 criminals per year. As I say, far too high. We don't want anyone to be released in that manner. It's now 262. That isn't just about resourcing. Something has gone badly wrong in the management and the culture of the prison service, and it's starting to get much worse as these numbers are spiking. And that is what needs to get fixed. Now, that is what David Lammy, as Justice Secretary, has to take responsibility for and really try to fix. He came to Parliament last week and said that he had put in place personally the most robust checks ever. They failed. What has gone wrong? He needs to put in place checks now to stop this.
You're definitely right on the numbers, Mr. Jenrick. In the 14 years of the Conservatives, there were 860 releases in error. In the last year, it's 262, just in 1 year alone, 860 in 14 years. So it's definitely gone up. Something has happened which has caused this. I mean, I guess over the last year, if I think about your contributions, they've been about immigration and people in tube stations and litter in the streets. I wonder whether you have given the government a hard enough time in the last year about what's happening in the justice system.
Well, look, I've been talking about this continuously in the 12 months that I've been in this role. In fact, I was outside Wandsworth jail earlier in the year talking about the failures of that prison, talking about the things that the Independent Monitoring Board had said, that it was a very poorly run prison. It was in special measures. You'd had one of the most senior governors in the prison having to leave their role after people had been released in suspicious circumstances. So, look, there are a lot of serious problems in our prisons, and they did not just begin in the last year, let's be honest, and there's no simple answers to this. But I do think at the heart of this problem is the fact that the Labour government chose to create an early release scheme that has been botched, and it's been disastrously executed. And a part of that has been the fact that the way it's been managed has let out people accidentally. And that has to be gripped now, because this has got really serious consequences. You've got people who are sex offenders who should be being deported out on the streets, and you've got the hard-pressed resources of the Met for the second time in a fortnight out across London now trying to track down somebody who should never have been released in the first place.
OK, Robert Jenrick, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Westminster. And we expect to see you going head-to-head with David Lammy in the House of Commons very soon.